was just a temp, or so they thought. Quiet, composed, always early, always prepared, but easy to overlook in a sea of suits and steel smiles. The only black man in the room, sitting at the edge of every meeting, never called on, never credited, just there to take notes, fetch water, and endure the slow burn of contempt disguised as company culture. No one cared to learn his name, certainly not the CEO, who preferred to mock him publicly, laughing louder each time the boardroom did. What no one knew, not the smug executives, not the clients shaking hands with empty eyes, not even the ones who chuckled awkwardly at the jokes they didn't fully understand, was that the man they dismissed was the one person in the building who held the power to unravel everything. What began as a series of offhand jabs and casual cruelty would spiral into the greatest corporate downfall they'd ever witness. And it all started with one man sitting silently, listening, watching, remembering. This is not just a story of injustice. It's a reckoning. If you're drawn in already, like and subscribe to follow this unraveling from beginning to end. Comment where you're watching from and what you think is really going on. Your insight might just catch the twist before it hits. The conference room sat on the top floor of Wacth COR's Midtown headquarters, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass panels that soaked the space in a sterile, early morning glow. The skyline shimmered beyond them, cold and unreachable. Inside, the air was tense with ambition and hierarchy, the kind of atmosphere where a misstep could end a career. At the head of the obsidian table stood Hollis Greer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver streak in his hair and a voice that carried like a gavel in court. He wore his confidence like armor and used it like a blade. Hollis was more than the CEO, he was the empire builder. And today, he was putting on a show. The $2.9 billion acquisition was the centerpiece of his legacy, and the room was filled with senior executives, strategic partners, and key board members. Every face at the table had been carefully selected, every seat carefully assigned, except, perhaps, one. Daxton Reed sat 3 seats from the end, posture composed but tense, a man visibly aware of his peripheral status. He wore a dark gray suit, not new, but sharp, his hands folded tightly on the legal pad before him. The temp badge clipped to his blazer's lapel marked him immediately, but it was the color of his skin and the absence of any title beneath his name that seemed to invite the disdain of the man in charge. Hollis moved into the Q4 profit forecast slide, eyes sweeping the room until they locked on Daxton. He paused. "Hold up," Hollis said, raising a finger mid-sentence. "Who's this?" His voice was loud enough to pause the assistant's note-taking. "Is this a delivery guy? Or did we upgrade catering?" The room stiffened. A few people smiled cautiously, uncertain whether it was a joke or a trap. Daxton straightened slightly, but said nothing. Hollis chuckled. "No, seriously. Who let the intern into the war room?" He waved a hand at Daxton without looking away. "Tell me you at least brought coffee." A few muffled laughs. The room waited for Daxton to speak, but he simply nodded, offering a respectful, "No, sir." Daxton Reed. "I'm the data consultant assigned to the Wacth COR Quantirum deal." He spoke clearly but quietly, as though trying to anchor dignity in a storm. Hollis's eyes narrowed. "Data consultant," he repeated with mock astonishment. "That's generous. I thought you were just observing for extra credit." He turned to the screen again, but with an exaggerated check of his watch, added, "Well, then make yourself useful. You're sitting at the table. Start scribbling, yeah? Like a good student." He reached across the table and tossed a gold Montblanc pen toward Daxton, the object clattering against the table before rolling to a stop just beside his pad. The silence was loud. Daxton picked up, nodding once. "Of course." His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly as he clicked the pen and began taking notes he'd already prepared the night before. The projection flicked to the revenue breakdown slide. Hollis continued as if nothing had happened. "Now let's get back to people who belong in this room." The implication hung thick in the air, coated in passive cruelty and unchecked arrogance. 10 minutes later, Hollis interrupted himself again mid-sentence. "Daxton, right? What do you make of this model? These numbers accurate to you?" Every head turned. Daxton blinked, startled to be addressed again. He glanced at his notes, then raised his eyes to the screen. Yes, they track, though the client-side figures show a discrepancy in deferred revenue recognition. Okay, Hollis said, cutting him off with a laugh. That's enough econometrics for one morning. I was asking for confidence, not a dissertation. Another wave of laughter. Daxton forced a closed-lip smile and lowered his eyes. The meeting continued, but the tone had shifted. Daxton's presence now served as the unspoken punchline. Whenever he adjusted in his seat or reached for a water bottle, Hollis seemed to find a way to jab at it. Let's keep it simple, so even our guest lecturer here can follow, he said once, motioning to Daxton while the slide transitioned. At another point, Hollis jokingly offered to send Daxton to find more chairs for the next meeting, in case any more diversity hires wandered in off the street. It wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. Hollis knew exactly how to erode a man's dignity without ever raising his voice. And the room, afraid of the man who held their careers in his hands, played along with silence. By the time the meeting adjourned, Daxton's shoulders felt heavy, his pen resting beside a pad filled with scribbles he could barely remember writing. His face was warm, flushed not with shame, but a sense of deep violation, like his very presence had been put on trial and found unworthy. Hollis stood, nodding to the room. All right, folks, that's enough theater. Let's close this thing. He turned to Daxton, flashing a smile devoid of sincerity. And you, nice work. I'll be sure to pass your notes along to the actual team. Daxton stood slowly, because effort in Daxton's world wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. When he walked through the thick glass doors of the boardroom just before 8 a.m., the mood inside already crackled with urgency. The long mahogany table was surrounded again by the familiar cluster of directors, analysts, and now new faces. External consultants from Latham and Brink had arrived, sent to evaluate the pending acquisition's long-term liabilities. Their presence made the stakes of the meeting exponentially higher. And with stakes came spectacle. Hollis Greer entered the room last, crisp in a slate suit, flanked by his inner circle. He barely acknowledged Daxton's presence, but made a point of stopping his stride mid-step and gesturing with a mock flourish. Ah, there he is, Hollis announced. Mr. Math Club himself. The consultants looked up, their expressions neutral but alert. Tell me, Daxton, Hollis said, rounding the table and tapping his tablet. You ready to crunch numbers in front of the big kids? Daxton hesitated only a moment before replying. I've prepared the projections for the regional uplift. They're aligned with the figures provided by finance. His voice was composed, too composed, and that seemed to irritate Hollis. Then let's give you the spotlight, he said, waving toward the monitor. Come on up, Professor. Daxton stood slowly, unsure if this was a genuine opportunity or another trap disguised as a test. He walked to the monitor, tapped a few keys, and brought up the spreadsheet he'd built overnight. The numbers lit up on the screen: net gain, projected margins, loss ratios by territory. He cleared his throat. If you look at the 36-month trailing indicator, no, Hollis cut in, stepping forward, arms crossed. Don't just throw jargon at us, Dax. Read it out loud, nice and clear, so even the consultants in the back row can understand. A few consultants exchanged puzzled glances. One of them, a woman with a notepad balanced on her lap, shifted uncomfortably. Daxton hesitated, then began to read. Projected EBITDA for the next quarter is $182.7 million, with a margin compression of 1.2. Hollis burst out laughing. Hold on. Did you just say 1.2? He turned to the room, grinning. Where'd you learn to count, Daxton? You sure you didn't pull that from detention math class? The room froze. No one laughed, but no one spoke either. Daxton stood there, exposed, voice silenced by the slap of shame echoing between the marble walls. Hollis grinned wider, undeterred by the silence. You know what? Let's give the numbers a rest. He clapped Daxton once on the back, not gently, then turned to the consultants. You have to understand, we like to invest in future leaders here. Some of them come straight from community programs. You know, diversity hires, sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. His tone was casual, as though he were complimenting the catering. "But you can't teach instinct," he added, nodding as if Daxton had just proven his point. The consultants didn't react. They scribbled notes, eyes on their pages. Some glanced at Daxton. Most didn't. Daxton felt his skin tighten with heat, the flush rising to his temples. He looked around for a lifeline, a colleague willing to speak up, a gesture, even a glance of solidarity. But what he met were dropped gazes and the polite disinterest of professionals who had learned to survive by staying silent. The moment lingered awkwardly, and then Hollis breezed past it as though nothing had happened. "Let's move on. Real numbers now," he said, dismissing Daxton with a wave of his hand. Daxton returned to his seat, legs slightly numb, breath shallow. He picked up his pen and began to scribble in the margins of his notepad, not because he had anything to write, but because he needed something to do with his hands. The rest of the meeting unfolded like a play he wasn't cast in. At one point, a slide glitched and the room paused. Daxton instinctively reached for the remote, intending to help, but Hollis stopped him with a single glance. "No need. Let's not have the intern rewire our systems," he said, sarcasm hanging like smoke. Laughter returned this time, not because the joke was funny, but because the room needed relief from the tension that had settled over it. The consultants, carefully neutral, said nothing. One of them, a man in a navy tie, nodded politely at Daxton on the way out, murmuring interesting model. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement Daxton received. After the meeting, Daxton stayed behind, pretending to organize his papers while the others filed out. Hollis lingered a moment longer, then turned back at the door. "You did well, Dax," he said with a smirk. "You've got guts. Stick around long enough, and we might even get you a real nameplate." The door closed behind him, leaving Daxton alone. The monitor still showed his spreadsheet, clean, accurate, professionally sound. But none of it mattered. The truth was, in that room, credibility had nothing to do with data. He believed that despite Hollis's cruelty, professionalism might still prevail somewhere within the walls of this company. That hope lasted precisely 3 minutes. When Daxton entered the 5th floor workspace, his desk was gone. Not reassigned or relocated, gone. In its place, against the far wall near the high-volume copier, sat a makeshift desk hastily assembled with mismatched parts. No drawers, no outlets nearby, just a rickety table with a chair that wobbled when he sat. His nameplate was missing. In its place was a small yellow sticky note slapped onto the desk's edge. "No access. Intern temporary." Daxton stared at it, confusion bleeding into disbelief, then anger. He turned to the front office assistant seated nearby and asked calmly, "What happened to my station?" She barely looked up from her screen. "Facilities request," she replied without inflection. "They said you're part of a short-term project and needed to make space for a visiting director." The copier behind him screeched to life, a reminder that this wasn't an office. It was now a hallway. Daxton adjusted his chair, trying to stabilize it, but the back support was missing one screw, and it tipped left with every shift in weight. He opened his laptop and logged in, intent on pushing forward, determined not to let an inconvenient desk derail his responsibilities. But the screen stayed blue longer than usual. When it finally loaded, 3 alerts popped up in red at the top corner. Access denied. Access denied. Access denied. The shared financial drives for the acquisition files had been restricted. Daxton's direct access to the modeling tools, internal reports, and client review folders, all gone. He blinked, opened a new tab, tried again. The same denials met him with each click. He stood and walked to the IT desk. A man in his late 20s looked up from his monitors. "Hey, I think there's a mistake," Daxton said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "My file access was working yesterday. This morning, everything's restricted." The IT guy squinted at Daxton's badge, tapped a few keys, then said, "Yeah, looks like your profile was downgraded. Temp class. Read-only access only to public folders." Daxton's mouth went dry. "Why?" The tech shrugged. "I just follow admin tickets, man. It came from upstairs. Probably a mistake. You can log a support ticket if you want." The door opened behind him. Hollis Greer walked through, carrying a cappuccino in a silver travel mug. He glanced at Daxton, then at the tech, and gave a casual nod. "Everything all right here?" he asked. His tone was light, but the edge behind it was unmistakable. The tech instantly straightened. "All good, Mr. Greer. Just some profile settings." Hollis's eyes flicked to Daxton. "Tech trouble, Professor?" Daxton's jaw tensed, but he kept his tone even. "Seems like I've lost access to the valuation files." Hollis sipped his coffee, then gave a faux concerned frown. "That's odd. I thought you were only shadowing the process." He leaned closer, voice dropping to a stage whisper. "Don't worry, Daxton. No one expects you to do the heavy lifting. Just take in the scenery." With a final smirk, he turned and walked away. Daxton stood motionless for a moment, the ambient hum of monitors and overhead lights pressing in around him. The tech didn't say anything else, and Daxton walked back to his makeshift desk. As he sat, the copier whirred again, belching out page after page, the machine shuddering with each print. This was his view now: a wall, a copier, and the faint smell of toner. He reopened his laptop and tried to work offline, pulling together insights from memory and previously downloaded sheets. He typed in silence for nearly an hour until another email popped into his inbox. Subject line: urgent, review meeting rescheduled. No greeting, no details, just a line at the bottom: temp staff not required to attend. The message was copied to the entire division. A second email followed minutes later, this one from a mid-level manager he'd never met. "Please relocate your belongings to the third floor bullpen for space optimization. Thanks." Daxton stared at the screen, pulse rising. He had already been moved. Now they wanted him even further removed, away from financials, away from strategy, away from visibility. He printed his own projections anyway and carried them upstairs. The bullpen was a gray, echoing space with long communal desks and no windows. The receptionist looked confused when he arrived. "You're assigned here?" she asked. "I thought this area was reserved for interns." "Apparently," Daxton said, placing his things down beside a flickering monitor. He opened the folder containing his work and stared at it for a long time. Numbers didn't lie. They told stories, patterns of trust, opportunity, risk. But the people reading them? They picked the narratives they wanted to hear. By noon, Daxton had heard whispers from 3 different team members. "Is he still on that project? I thought he was just here for diversity compliance." Didn't Hollis say he was some kind of grad student? That last one hurt more than it should have. Daxton had built billion-dollar models, advised 2 tech unicorns before they went public, and lectured at Stanford. But here, none of it mattered. He ate lunch alone at his desk, while emails continued to pile up. Project updates he was no longer included on, meetings he was no longer invited to, reports he was expected to observe, but not touch. Even his calendar was empty. The silence of exclusion was louder than the copier had ever been. Late in the day, he returned to the 5th floor, hoping to find anyone, who could clarify his standing. But the glass office of the division lead was dark. A junior associate passed him in the hall without making eye contact. At his old desk, now occupied by a visiting analyst, sat a new nameplate: Clint Mercer Project Lead. Daxton recognized the name from a company-wide memo, a recent hire with no experience in finance, but a cousin of one of the board members. Daxton turned away, walking past the break room where laughter erupted over someone's birthday cake. He reached the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The digital numbers ticked slowly downward, each second thick with inertia. When the doors finally opened, he stepped inside, pressed the lobby button, and leaned against the back wall. Despite being reassigned to the 3rd floor bullpen and denied access to critical resources, Daxton still showed up on time, still wore the sharpest blazer in his closet, and still prepared for every potential question that might come his way. What he didn't prepare for was the slow, calculated erosion of his psychological stability, an erosion that began before noon that day. A quarterly client visit had been scheduled for that morning with representatives from Corin Partners, a venture firm rumored to be exploring long-term joint investment opportunities with Vail COR. Hollis, true to his nature, turned the visit into a stage play, and the boardroom into his theater. Daxton wasn't told he'd be attending the session, but 10 minutes before the clients arrived, a junior assistant sprinted into the bullpen and breathlessly said, "Mr. Greer needs you upstairs." Now, boardroom 3. Without asking why, Daxton grabbed his notebook and moved quickly. By the time he stepped into the room, the clients were already seated. Hollis, standing by the head of the table, glanced up and frowned with exaggerated confusion. "Well, look who finally joined us," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Darius, the temp. Always good for last-minute backup. Daxton froze for a split second. He opened his mouth, but no correction came. He heard the name misused, twisted, repurposed as something lesser. The clients glanced at one another. One woman looked down awkwardly. Hollis gestured grandly toward the water station. "Why don't you be a gentleman and grab some drinks for our guests?" The tone was condescending, but delivered with a grin wide enough to be confused for charm. Daxton nodded once, turned and poured 4 glasses of water, placing them carefully before each client, avoiding eye contact. Hollis winked at one of them and added, "He's new to corporate culture, still finding his rhythm." Daxton returned to his seat at the far end of the table, quietly flipping open his notebook, even though he already knew he'd never be asked to contribute. He spent the remainder of the meeting silently enduring his erasure, while Hollis dominated the conversation with performative insights, peppered with inside jokes that required familiarity Daxton was never granted. By the time the clients left, the room buzzed with polite applause and thin compliments. Hollis passed Daxton by on his way out and muttered low enough that only he could hear, "Nice touch with the service routine. You're good at that." Then he was gone. Daxton remained seated long after the room had emptied, his face expressionless, his spirit dented again. Another hit, small and quiet, but targeted with surgical precision. He went back downstairs, eyes dry but unfocused, wondering if his silence made him complicit in his own degradation. He logged into his computer to document a few notes from memory, only to find his desktop had changed. Where his background once held the company's standard branding was now a white screen showing a single open email draft. The subject line read, "Performance concern, cultural fit." The body of the message had been written in blunt corporate-friendly language, suggesting Daxton was underperforming in collaboration and showing limited adaptation to Vail COR's team culture. The sender's name wasn't attached, but the file path indicated it came from someone in internal communications, possibly HR, possibly a planted file. His stomach turned as he scrolled. It mentioned his relocation to the bullpen as a corrective strategy and implied a recommendation for early termination if progress wasn't visible. His mouse hovered over the X to close the draft, but he couldn't bring himself to click it. He opened the file properties. It had been created 2 hours earlier. He hadn't even arrived at the office then. The file wasn't an accident. It was planted, deliberate. Daxton stared at the screen for a full minute before slowly reaching into his bag and retrieving his own tablet. He screenshotted the draft, timestamps and all, then backed up the file to his personal cloud drive. He didn't know who wrote it, but the intent was clear. It was a setup, not just to discredit him, but to psychologically dismantle him, to make him doubt his standing, to push him to resign, just so no one would have to fire him and face consequences. But what hurt most wasn't the manipulation. It was the realization that everyone around him knew and did nothing. People saw the treatment, heard the comments, laughed at the jabs. But they said nothing, not because they agreed necessarily, but because silence was safer. And he was alone. Later that afternoon, an all-staff email went out with highlights from the client visit. Hollis's name appeared 5 times, each one followed by words like commendation, leadership, and visionary. Daxton was not mentioned. The email closed with a quote from Hollis about empowering team culture through clear roles and confident voices. Daxton read it twice. Then again, he opened his browser and navigated to the company's internal portal, where employee feedback reports were archived. The system required clearance, but his login still allowed him to view historical summaries. He searched for his own evaluations. None existed. Not one entry. Not a single line that acknowledged he was part of the structure. He was invisible by design. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as intended. By 5 p.m., the office was emptying. People walked past him without a glance, talking about dinner plans and weekend getaways. He remained seated, still staring at the now-closed draft email on his screen, heart steady, but waited. There were no tears, just quiet resolve, slowly forming. He hadn't spoken up because part of him feared the backlash. He walked into the bullpen at 7:30 a.m. and found his workstation untouched, exactly as he left it, yet somehow colder, emptier, as if it had been abandoned overnight. His chair still leaned crooked. His screensaver still glitched slightly at the bottom corner, and the faint smell of printer toner still wafted from the nearby copier. He placed his bag down, opened his laptop, and started combing through his backup files. After what had happened the previous day with the planted HR email, Daxton had begun documenting everything: timestamps, screenshots, file metadata, and email headers. He had no intention of initiating a confrontation, not yet. He still clung to the belief that professionalism, integrity, and consistency would yield recognition, or at the very least, protection. By 9:15, the office was fully awake. The usual chatter filled the hallways, rapid-fire footsteps echoed past his desk, and the company's signature hospitality carts began rolling by with fresh croissants and coffee for senior staff. As he typed, Daxton noticed a flurry of calendar updates on his screen. One caught his eye, an all-staff lunch invite sent to everyone on the floor except him. He opened the event and saw the subject line: Team Recognition and Acquisition Q2 Strategy Sync. It included names from every department, including interns, support staff, and newly hired analysts. The location was just down the hall. He scrolled through the recipients. His name wasn't there. He searched his inbox again, just to be sure. Nothing. It wasn't a mistake. He had been deliberately excluded from a gathering designed to celebrate contributions to the very project he'd quietly helped hold together. At 11:30, the hallway began to buzz with activity. Staff laughed louder than usual. Cologne mingled with the smell of catered food, and the chatter turned to presentations and speeches and who would be sitting with whom. Daxton remained seated, listening as people walked by, carrying gift bags and joke-filled agendas. No one looked his way. He tried to work, pulling together revised analytics for a risk assessment report that had never officially been assigned to him. The numbers blurred slightly as he stared too long at the same cell. Around noon, the office emptied. Daxton stood and walked slowly to the break room, intending to refill his coffee. As he passed the executive suite, he heard voices from the slightly ajar door of Hollis Greer's office. "I'm telling you, his resume looks printed from Craigslist," Hollis was saying, his voice half-laughing. "Daxton? Darius? Whatever. No pedigree, no polish, just a placeholder to check boxes." Another voice chuckled in response, deep, amused, approving. "Well, he's quiet," the director replied. "Harmless." Hollis scoffed. "He's quiet because he knows he's out of his league. Don't worry, I'll have HR clean up the loose ends after the announcement. We don't need someone like that in the frame." Daxton froze just outside the door, heart pounding. He turned and walked quickly back to his desk, appetite gone, face tight. He tried to work, but his mind spun, the words echoing in his skull like a hammer striking steel. Out of his league, placeholder, Craigslist. The rest of the afternoon dragged like a storm cloud refusing to break. The staff lunch stretched 2 hours. Laughter occasionally floated down the hallway. Around 2:30 p.m., Hollis returned to the bullpen for the first time in days. He was walking with 3 directors and a strategy consultant Daxton hadn't seen before. They entered the adjacent conference room for a quick briefing. Daxton, sitting just outside the glass wall, heard his name mentioned. Not invited, but referenced. A few minutes later, a junior analyst came out and approached him. "They need a quick report on the margin deltas you flagged last week," she said. "Would you mind sitting in?" Daxton nodded, gathered his materials, and entered the room. The air shifted the moment he walked in. Hollis glanced at him with a look that said, "You again?" One of the directors offered a forced smile. The consultant was mid-sentence when Daxton sat. The discussion turned to growth trends and competitive advantage forecasts. Hollis outlined his vision in broad strokes, turning occasionally to the whiteboard, ignoring data points in the binder that Daxton had authored. When a graph was misinterpreted by one of the directors, Daxton quietly cleared his throat and said, "Actually, if I may, those figures reflect adjusted projections factoring in the Q2 variances from." Hollis raised his hand without turning. "You had your turn," he said loudly enough to stun the room. "Let the grown-ups talk." The consultant blinked. One of the directors winced. Daxton stopped mid-sentence. The rest of the explanation locked behind his teeth. His hands slowly retreated from the edge of the table. His back straightened. Silence followed for a few seconds too long. Hollis smirked at the whiteboard, as if amused by his own authority. No one corrected him. No one asked Daxton to continue. The meeting pressed forward without another word from him. When it ended, everyone left the room in groups of 2 or 3, murmuring politely. Hollis exited last, tossing a casual, "Thanks for stopping in, Darius," over his shoulder. Daxton stood alone in the empty conference room, staring at the words on the whiteboard. They weren't just numbers. They were his numbers. He greeted stakeholders with theatrical charm, shook hands with a grip that always lasted a second too long, and shot smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. His every movement was calculated, his every word preloaded with agenda. This was his stage, and he would own it. Daxton Reed entered quietly, as always, dressed in a fitted navy suit and a white shirt pressed so sharply it looked sculpted. He carried a leather folio under his arm, the edges filled with notes, datasets, and alternative models he had compiled, polished, and fact-checked in solitude. Despite everything, the demotion, the public silencing, the whispers, he showed up on time, ready, composed. His seat was at the back, far from a screen and even further from the voices that mattered. But he sat straight, eyes alert, jaw firm. The hum of nervous energy grew as the room filled. Light bounced off chrome accents and glass surfaces. The AV team adjusted mics and camera angles. A PR rep hovered at the edge of the room with a clipboard. And Hollis, center stage, tapped the remote, advancing his slides with exaggerated flair. "Welcome everyone," he began. "We're about to make history." The first few slides were conventional, financial highlights, synergy forecasts, staff integration plans. Hollis's voice rolled over the room like practice thunder. Executives nodded. A few smiled. One board member even clapped softly after the third slide. But just before the halfway point, the lights dimmed slightly as Hollis turned back to the screen and said, "Now let's take a moment to highlight the unsung heroes of our journey." He clicked again. The screen changed. At first, no one spoke. Then came the laughter. At the center of the slide was a photoshopped image, Daxton's face, crudely pasted onto the body of a janitor wearing overalls, holding a mop, standing next to a cartoonishly overflowing trash bin. Underneath the image, in bold Comic Sans font, were the words, "Vale COR's Real Cleanup Crew." The laughter came fast, some of it confused, most of it hesitant, but loud enough to hurt. Hollis grinned, turning back to the room. "Every empire needs a mascot, right?" He pointed at Daxton, still smiling. "Just don't touch the touchscreens, yeah?" A few people glanced toward the back of the room where Daxton sat, frozen. The PR camera turned slightly, catching Hollis's joke on film. A consultant in the third row raised an eyebrow. A director chuckled nervously. The AV technician tried not to look anywhere at all. But no one intervened. No one said a word. Daxton didn't move. His hands remained still in his lap, though his fingers had curled tightly around the edge of the folio. Inside his chest, his heart pounded with fury and shame, an unbearable collision of violation and helplessness. He couldn't look away from the screen. The image stayed up longer than necessary. Hollis chuckled again, then waved the remote. All right, let's get serious," he said, clicking forward. The next slide returned to metrics, but the tone in the room had already changed. Something irreparable had happened, and Daxton felt every second of it crawling beneath his skin. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Reports were read, graphs analyzed, Questions asked and answered, but none of it touched Daxton. He sat in silence, blood pounding in his ears, his entire body rigid, as if his muscles could absorb the humiliation that had just been burned into public memory. He couldn't even bring himself to blink for a moment, afraid that any movement might shatter the thin layer of composure he'd forced over himself. Eventually, the lights came back up. People stood, chatting in casual tones, collecting their things, and pretending not to notice the man in the back of the room who had just been turned into a joke. Hollis approached him then, still grinning, as if they were both in on the gag. "Hey, take it easy, Professor," he said under his breath. "It's just culture. Everyone gets teased once in a while. Don't be so sensitive." Daxton looked up at him, eyes flat. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply blinked once and turned back to the screen. Hollis shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said, and walked away. After everyone left, Daxton remained seated, alone in the massive conference room. The lights dimmed slightly again on a timer, leaving the space cast in a pale blue glow from the projector. The slide had long since been changed, but he still saw the image in his mind. He reached into his folio and pulled out a small recording device he had placed in the room earlier that morning. He pressed stop. The red light blinked once, then vanished. Every word had been captured. Every joke, every insult, every laugh. He saved the file, encrypted it, and uploaded it to a drive only he could access. Then he stood slowly, placed the folio under his arm, and walked out without a word. Down the hall, through the elevator, across the glass foyer. He moved like a shadow, visible to everyone yet unseen. When he reached the lobby, he stepped outside into the cold wind of early evening. The sky was gray, the sidewalks damp. The city moved around him, alive with noise and indifference. Daxton took a breath, steadying himself. The image haunted him, but it would not destroy him. He had been humiliated in front of partners, executives, and clients. Conversations about quarterly figures resumed. Emails flew back and forth with urgency and manufactured enthusiasm, and preparations for the final phase of the Quantirum acquisition rolled forward without interruption. But beneath that surface, something invisible was shifting. Daxton Reed, who had endured 6 stages of degradation, remained at his desk, still wearing the label of intern, still ignored in strategy threads, still watching silently as the company dismissed him as a footnote. But inside, something essential had hardened. Not bitterness, not vengeance, just clarity, a pure, unshakable certainty that the time for silence had ended. The following Monday, Vail COR scheduled its most publicized meeting yet, the formal investor relations briefing and internal handover, where all division heads, external partners, and strategic advisors were invited to review the final timeline of the merger. The event was to be streamed live to internal networks, filmed for media distribution, and hosted in Vail COR's high-tech auditorium. Hollis Greer, of course, would be the face of the event. He entered the room 15 minutes early, wearing a charcoal suit and a thin smile of confidence. The auditorium was already half full, and as more executives trickled in, Daxton entered quietly through the side door, unnoticed by most. He wore the same navy suit from the previous week, but this time his stride carried a weight that did not yield. He did not sit in the back row. He walked to the front, eyes level, spine straight, and stood beside the table where Hollis's speaking materials had been arranged. Some heads turned. A few brows lifted in surprise. One of the board members whispered something to a colleague, pointing toward Daxton's silhouette. But he ignored them. He set down a black folder in front of the center microphone, opened it slowly, and placed a tablet beside it. The room quieted as Hollis approached, confusion dancing behind his polished smile. "What are you doing?" he asked under his breath, masking it with a grin. Daxton didn't look at him. Instead, he touched the microphone and said, "I'll begin now." The sound of his voice, strong, measured, and absolutely unshakable, stilled the room. The auditorium's hum died instantly. All eyes turned forward. Hollis opened his mouth to speak, but Daxton held up a hand, not with defiance, but authority. A few of the seated directors exchanged glances. The moment was off script, And something about the way Daxton carried himself shifted the energy in the room. "My name is Daxton Arid," he said. "And before this meeting proceeds, I believe there are a few facts that require correction." The screens behind him flickered. The Veil COR logo was replaced with a projection from Daxton's tablet. The room darkened slightly as the screen lit up, revealing internal acquisition charts. But not Veil CORs. Monarch Equity Group's. There was a collective intake of breath. Monarch was a shadow investor, the firm whose capital had driven the acquisition quietly from behind the scenes, a group so powerful their influence rarely needed introduction. Daxton turned a page in his folder and continued, his voice gaining power as it moved. "I am Executive Vice President of Strategic Oversight for Monarch Equity Group. Since the beginning of this negotiation, I have led the performance auditing, risk analysis, and final valuation review for Monarch's involvement in the Quantirum acquisition. For the past 7 weeks, I have been embedded within Veil COR to assess not only financial viability, but internal leadership culture and ethical structure. My role here was not to observe, it was to decide." The room was frozen. Hollis stared at him, face pale, lips parted as if trying to form a sentence, but unable to find the words. The executives began to murmur. The PR team glanced at each other, realizing the live broadcast was still running. Daxton did not pause. "What I have seen within these walls," he said, "has fallen short not only of best practices, but of basic human decency. I have endured intentional humiliation, strategic exclusion, and calculated abuse. Not from rogue employees, but from the highest office in this organization. I was degraded in front of clients, denied access to critical systems, misrepresented publicly, and finally reduced to a caricature, on camera, during a live corporate event." His words were quiet, but they cracked like thunder. No one moved. The only sound in the room was the slow, steady hum of the projector. "I documented every instance. I recorded every word. And this," he tapped the black folder, "contains transcripts, screenshots, internal memos, and footage." He turned to look at Hollis directly, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. "It's no longer a question of if Monarch withdraws its offer. The only question left is whether this board will act in accordance with the standards of integrity you all claim to uphold, or if you will choose silence in the face of absolute truth." A sharp gasp came from one of the front rows. One of the external partners stood abruptly. "Turn off the feed," someone whispered near the back. "No," another voice said louder. "Let it finish." The board chair, a woman who had remained quiet throughout, finally leaned forward and spoke. "Mr. Reed," she said evenly, "what are you asking for?" Daxton didn't hesitate. "I'm not asking," he replied. "I'm stating. Monarch Equity will not be moving forward with this acquisition under current leadership conditions. We will be reassessing our terms, and we'll be conducting a full reputational audit, effective immediately." Hollis finally found his voice. "You lied," he spat, his composure cracking. "You pretended to be someone else. That's fraud." Daxton turned back to him, the calm still in his eyes. "No, Mr. Greer. I simply didn't correct your assumptions. Everything else was truth. The truth you refused to see. The truth you mocked." He gathered his folder, stepped back from the microphone, and walked away slowly, the silence behind him more powerful than applause. The cameras kept rolling. The room didn't move. And in the span of 7 minutes, everything changed. The screens behind him still displayed the Monarch Equity Group logo, a quiet, steady reminder that power had shifted, and that what had just happened was not a bluff, not a scandal to be spun away, but the formal end of a regime. Hollis Greer stood motionless, a faint sheen of sweat visible across his brow, his suit collar no longer crisp, his posture unraveling, as if the suit itself could no longer carry the weight of his legacy. The camera feeds remained live, the lenses now capturing the spectacle of a man slowly being stripped of authority by a voice he had once laughed at. Daxton did not leave the building. He walked to the edge of the stage, opened the second half of his black folder, and handed it to the board chair, who accepted it without hesitation. "This contains supplemental evidence," he said clearly, his voice amplified again by the microphone he had never turned off. It includes detailed transcripts of meetings, recorded conversations, and security footage matched with company email traffic. You will find time-coded cross-references, witness statements submitted under confidentiality, and a forensic audit performed by Monarch's compliance team. All of it has been verified. The board chair opened the folder, and her eyes scanned the first few pages with a growing chill. She passed the documents down the row. A ripple of movement followed. People leaned forward. Phones came out. Screens lit up. And then came the wave. One of the screens behind Daxton split into 4 live panels, each playing a muted video loop. One showed Hollis mocking Daxton during a client briefing. Another captured him in mid-laugh as the janitor's slide appeared on screen. A third displayed a snippet of audio, showing the waveform of his voice calling Daxton a placeholder to a director. The fourth showed the fake HR email being edited by one of Hollis's own aides at 7:13 a.m., the timestamp pulsing in bright red at the corner. The videos looped without sound, but the visuals were damning enough. No explanation could twist them. No narrative could excuse them. A hush descended again as people began to understand that this was not about offense. It was about systemic rot, a deliberate campaign of humiliation that had tainted every inch of leadership and now threatened the company's entire future. From the side of the auditorium, the director of internal affairs stood and spoke into her phone. "I need security on site." Now, 2 guards entered quietly and moved to the side wall, their presence unannounced but understood. Hollis turned to the board. "You can't be serious," he said, voice cracking beneath the weight of unraveling ego. "This is theater. He's a spy, a saboteur." The board chair finally spoke. "He's an executive vice president of our majority investor. You never once asked who he was. You never verified his credentials. And every decision you made confirmed why this evaluation was necessary." Hollis took a step forward, voice rising. "You're going to believe him over me? I built this company. I created this deal." "No," Daxton said, still calm, still centered. "You built a stage. You used people as props. And you thought no one was watching." The room's lights suddenly adjusted. The AV lead turned off the looping videos and switched to a final slide, Monarch Equity Group, revised leadership transition plan. Daxton took the floor again, but this time without a script, without notes, and without hesitation. "Effective immediately, Monarch Equity Group is freezing the final transfer of funds for the Quantirum acquisition," he said. "We will restructure our offer under revised terms. A new leadership slate will be proposed to this board, and full compliance audits will be conducted before any disbursement is approved." Gasps echoed down the rows. "This isn't retaliation," Daxton added. "It's risk containment, and it's long overdue." As if on cue, the security officers stepped forward. Hollis backed away, hands slightly raised. "You can't do this," he said, voice now desperate, tinged with disbelief. "This is a hostile takeover." The board chair stood. "No," she said coldly. "This is accountability." One officer stepped to Hollis's side, gently but firmly motioning him toward the exit. The other followed. Hollis looked around the room for an ally, anyone willing to speak, to interrupt, to protest. No one moved. Not a word was spoken. The same executives who had laughed with him now stared at the floor, their silence final, their complicity laid bare. He turned back to Daxton once more, searching for a final line, something to say that might restore dignity. But Daxton's gaze remained unmoved. The room watched as Hollis Greer, architect of empires, was escorted out of the building he once ruled, not in chains, but in silence. The cameras followed him until the doors closed behind him. Then Daxton turned back to the audience. "To those who supported the truth, thank you," he said. "To those who chose silence, you now have a choice. Become part of the solution or step aside." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle fully. "I don't want apologies. I want transformation." Applause did not erupt. No ovation came. The room remained heavy with consequence, but a new stillness had arrived. Not one born of fear, but of reckoning. Somewhere in the back, a hand raised slowly. It was one of the junior analysts, barely 30, eyes wide but clear. "What comes next?" she asked. Daxton stepped forward. Transparency, oversight, and leadership that earns respect instead of demanding obedience. Within 30 minutes of the briefing, copies of the recording were archived on secure legal servers, while edited versions began to circulate through internal whistleblower networks. What had begun as a strategic restructuring proposal evolved swiftly into a full-blown corporate reckoning. The markets reacted first. The next morning, Vail COR's stock opened 14% lower and fell another 8% by midday. Investment forums buzzed with speculation, dissecting the footage frame by frame, analyzing Daxton's delivery with the same scrutiny usually reserved for high-profile CEO earnings calls. Headlines screamed across news tickers: corporate tyrant ousted in $2.9 billion scandal. Vail COR implodes under executive abuse allegations, and the janitor slide that sank a fortune. The footage of Hollis Greer being escorted out of the auditorium by security, face pale and fingers twitching with disbelief, became the viral centerpiece of every media story. Late-night anchors parroted it with ruthless accuracy. Business analysts weighed in with increasingly damning assessments, calling Vail COR a cautionary tale of unchecked egos and corporate cruelty. The company's board held emergency meetings behind closed doors for 3 consecutive days. When the internal audit report, commissioned quietly by Monarch but conducted by an independent firm, was released to senior leadership, its contents were damning beyond expectation. Pages documented a culture of intimidation. Repeated HR violations swept under the rug. Performance reviews altered to favor insiders. Compliance rules ignored or manipulated. And a string of quiet terminations of employees who had dared to question the top brass. At the center of it all, Hollis Greer. He hadn't simply violated policies. He had built mechanisms to bypass them. Anonymous surveys were buried. Exit interviews redacted. Entire departments reorganized to cover up whistleblower accounts. Worst of all, a portion of the financial data used to promote the Quantirum acquisition was shown to have been massaged. Key risk factors hidden behind convoluted data structures. What Daxton had exposed was only the beginning. On the 4th day, the board released a public statement. Carefully worded, but devoid of sympathy, it confirmed Hollis Greer's termination, announced a complete internal restructuring, and formally apologized to employees past and present who had been harmed by the company's toxic leadership. The statement acknowledged Daxton Reed by name, referred to his role in the events as instrumental, and confirmed full cooperation with state and federal investigators. That same morning, the SEC opened a preliminary review. Subpoenas followed within hours. Financial regulators flagged Vail COR for immediate audit. Press trucks lined the street outside their headquarters by noon. Inside the building, chaos gave way to vacancy. At least 6 department heads resigned over the next 2 days, citing either personal reassessment or ethical divergence. Most were seen removing items from their offices in silence, escorted by compliance officers who offered no pleasantries. Internal Slack channels, once alive with chatter, became ghost towns. Every message now bore a timestamp and a trace. Teams scheduled meetings only to cancel them minutes later, unsure of what was permissible and what would be recorded. As for Hollis, his fall was immediate and absolute. Within 48 hours of the briefing, his company-issued devices were locked remotely. His email address was deactivated. His Vail COR access badge revoked. All personal accounts tied to company resources, travel, stock options, discretionary spending, were frozen pending investigation. The luxury condo he had charged to the executive housing budget was reclaimed. He attempted to issue a statement through a crisis PR firm, but the response from public forums and investors was universally scathing. He was branded a tyrant, a fraud, and a symbol of everything wrong with modern corporate elitism. In response, Monarch Equity issued a rare direct rebuttal, stating, "Mr. Greer's conduct does not reflect isolated misjudgment. It reflects a systemic failure of leadership. We do not reward humiliation. We invest in integrity." The words were repeated across dozens of outlets, spoken aloud by CEOs during TED Talks, turned into LinkedIn headlines and Fortune cover blurbs. In his private world, Hollis Greer began to feel the suffocation of irrelevance. Calls from allies went unanswered. Invitations to elite summits were withdrawn. Private messages from trusted board members turned cold. Legalese replacing camaraderie. One partner advised him quietly, withdraw from public view. There's nothing left to defend. His attorney filed motions to prevent access to certain files, but the courts sided with federal oversight. Investigators began combing through 6 years of financial records, emails, and audit logs. Personal expenses charged to the company, travel, gifts, even renovation costs on a vacation estate, came under forensic review. A fraud specialist from the Treasury Department flagged 5 discrepancies within the first audit cycle. A formal investigation was opened within the week. For the remaining Vail COR staff, work became surreal. Daily operations resumed, but beneath a pall of uncertainty. Rumors swirled about who would be named interim CEO. Daxton's name emerged early in the speculation, but Monarch remained silent, carefully observing. Behind closed doors, Daxton met with compliance officers, external investigators, and board representatives. He answered questions with clarity, provided documents when requested, and refused interviews, staying quiet while the world around him screamed his name. In the employee lounges, people spoke of him in hushed tones, some with awe, others with shame. A few who had once laughed at the jokes now avoided eye contact when they passed him in the halls. In one internal memo, a senior executive who had previously endorsed Hollis's leadership wrote, "We were not blind. We were complicit. The silence around us was not confusion, it was cowardice." Mr. Reed reminded us what courage looks like. The memo was circulated anonymously, but everyone knew who had written it. When asked for comment by the Wall Street Journal, Daxton issued only a single sentence: "Justice, when denied, becomes a storm that waits patiently for the silence to end." In the months following the collapse, Vail COR underwent a transformation. Its leadership gutted, its brand scarred, and its foundation rattled by the revelation of the corporate rot it had incubated for years. The company stood on the edge of extinction. But extinction never came. Instead, under the firm, watchful hand of Monarch Equity, the company began a painful but deliberate rebirth. At the heart of that rebirth was Daxton A. Reed, not as a messiah, not as a media darling, but as a symbol of what leadership could become when rooted in conviction rather than ego, in transparency rather than manipulation. The public hadn't forgotten the image of him standing calmly in front of the board, unflinching, dignified, unwavering, as he exposed layer upon layer of systemic cruelty. That image became a landmark, not just in business circles, but in the broader cultural landscape. Universities dissected it. HR departments reshaped their training programs around it. Startups posted it in their welcome decks under the heading, "Speak the Truth, even when it hurts." But while the world rallied behind Daxton, the people who had stood in the shadows of Hollis Greer had to come to terms with their silence. For some, that reckoning came with resignation and retreat. For others, it became a catalyst for change. One by one, former executives, those who had once laughed at Daxton's expense, who had watched him reduced to a caricature, who had stood idly by as he was erased from meetings and mocked in public, began to step forward. At first, their apologies came in private messages, quietly sent late at night, full of shame and gratitude. Then they came in public letters, posted to the company's intranet, read aloud during staff town halls. One of the most surprising letters came from Marcellus Bain, a longtime director who had sat at Hollis's right hand for nearly a decade. "I watched a man treated like an extra in his own narrative," Bain wrote, "and I said nothing. Not because I didn't know better, but because I was afraid to lose favor. That fear cost me my voice. I will never make that mistake again." These statements were not part of a PR campaign. They weren't polished or perfect. They were raw, real, and, for the first time in Vail COR's history, honest. The sincerity of those messages marked the beginning of a new culture, one that didn't pretend the past hadn't happened, but one that refused to repeat it. as Daxton stepped into an official role as Chief Integrity Officer, a position Monarch created specifically to rebuild trust within Vale-sur-Loire. He set the tone immediately. The first policy he implemented was a complete overhaul of the feedback and reporting systems, designed so that even the most junior employee could speak out without fear of retaliation. The second was a rotating leadership forum, where every week, employees at all levels sat with executives to discuss strategy, culture, and concerns in real time. No topics were off-limits. No seats were restricted. The third was a mentorship program, pairing those who had been silenced with those who had once held power, creating dialogues that forced accountability to become personal. But the most impactful change came from the people themselves. For the first time, the walls at Vale-sur-Loire echoed with something unfamiliar: truth. Not just in boardrooms or earnings calls, but in the way people spoke to each other in the elevator, in the way they listened during meetings, in the way they refused to laugh at cruelty disguised as charisma. The shift wasn't immediate. There were stumbles. There were people who resisted, who tried to cloak old behavior in new language. But each time, the system pushed back, not with punishment, but with reflection. That was Daxton's most enduring legacy. He hadn't come to punish Vale-sur-Loire. He had come to teach it how to see. Meanwhile, Hollis Greer's name became a cautionary whisper. The federal inquiries into his conduct expanded beyond Vale-sur-Loire, tracing lines to other ventures and partnerships, slowly dismantling the image he had spent decades building. He disappeared from the public eye entirely. But inside the walls of a quiet rehabilitation facility tucked away in Vermont, he began a different journey. For weeks, he resisted. He denied, deflected, tried to tell himself he had been betrayed by his board, by his company, by some elaborate smear campaign. But the footage wouldn't stop. The recordings played back over and over in his head. The sound of his own voice mocking Daxton, laughing at pain, commanding silence. Slowly, he stopped resisting. Slowly, he started to remember who he had been before ambition had twisted into arrogance. The counselors didn't rush him. They let him sit in silence. They let him watch the briefing over and over, each time stopping to ask, "Why did you say that?" or "What were you afraid of?" He didn't have answers at first, only shame. But shame, they told him, was where transformation began. One night, after a particularly difficult session, he sat down and wrote a letter. Not to the board, not to the press, but to Daxton. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to explain. He simply wrote, "You deserve better. And I never deserved your silence." He never sent it, but writing it changed something in him. Months later, a quietly placed article appeared in a business ethics journal. It was authored anonymously, but its voice was unmistakable. The title read, "I was the villain in the room," and it detailed the evolution of a man who had led through fear and forgotten how to lead through empathy. The article did not excuse his actions. It didn't beg for sympathy. It simply told the truth. That one piece was shared among executive circles more than any leadership book that year. It was read aloud in boardrooms, highlighted in leadership retreats, and discussed in MBA classrooms. And in one corner of the internet, Daxton read it too. He never commented, never responded, but he read every word. Back at Vale-sur-Loire, things had changed. Not in the superficial way companies rebrand, but in the way that matters. People stayed longer. Feedback loops grew louder. Diversity wasn't a checkbox, it was a value. The next intern hired was placed not in the bullpen, but given a seat on the strategy team their first day. When asked by an external consultant how they felt working under Daxton's leadership, one young analyst replied, "It feels like truth walks these halls now." That truth was never perfect, but it was real, and real was enough. The end. Thanks for reading this story through to the end. If you enjoyed the journey, consider liking and subscribing to support more content like this. It helps more than you know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the plot. What did you think of Daxton's transformation and the redemption arc? Which part hit hardest for you? Let me know where you're watching or reading from and drop a comment with your take. Was there a twist that caught you off guard? Or a moment that stuck with you? I'm reading every reply.